Teachers, what's the best true excuse you've heard for being late? Story 1. Not a teacher, but as an admin at a music school, I once received a frantic call from a mother. She informed me that her daughter might be late or miss her guitar lesson because she couldn't find her. I assured her I would let the teacher know. About an hour later, the same mom called back, relieved. She had found her daughter, who had gone to a friend's house and decided to dye her hair bright green. They lived close by, so I told them they could still come in for the lesson. The mom said she'd call me back to confirm, but never did. However, the daughter showed up for her lesson 5 minutes late, sporting this rad, bright green quiff. It looked amazing, but it was certainly a unique build-up to an event I had never expected to witness. Story 2. I was one of about 20 kids who showed up late for school one day. When we arrived at the school office as a group, the administrators were naturally curious about why we were all late. Our answer? The school bus blew up. So the engine blew up? They questioned, trying to make sense of our story. No, the whole bus. In flames. It blew up, we insisted. The teachers exchanged skeptical glances, clearly thinking we were embellishing. Then, one of the admin staff opened a news website revealing a photo of an entire bus engulfed in flames with a bunch of kids in our school uniforms standing in front of it. Our late slips for class read, "School bus blew up." It was a horrifying experience, and I can only imagine how worried the parents were about letting their kids ride the bus after that. Story 3. This wasn't school-related, but one night I was robbed at gunpoint and had my car stolen. I spent the early hours of the morning talking to the cops and detectives. Despite the ordeal, I showed up to work the next day, albeit an hour late. Even in the high-stress environment of public accounting, my supervisors understood. They said, this is clearly an appropriate reason not to come into work, right? In hindsight, I probably should have taken the day off. My coworkers thought I was crazy for brushing off such a traumatic event and showing up to work as if nothing happened. Story 4. Back in high school, I missed first period once for a pretty unique reason. My then boyfriend was camping outside overnight in front of the NYC Macy's for a chance to buy one of the first 200 Lady Gaga perfumes. Those first 200 came with a ticket to her Macy's launch event, which included a meet and greet. My parents had said that I couldn't sleep overnight outside Macy's, so I didn't go. But the next morning, around 7:30, I got a call from my boyfriend. He said they hadn't sold out of all 200, and if I wanted one, I had to get there ASAP. I raced to catch a bus to the city from New Jersey, sprinted from Port Authority to Macy's, bought the perfume, got the pass, sprinted back, caught the bus, and ran to class. When my English teacher asked why I missed first period, I simply said, "Sorry, I was picking up tickets to Lady Gaga's perfume launch event." Missing one class in high school for a Lady Gaga launch? I think I made the right choice. It was just one class after all. Story 5. I teach a college freshman paper writing class, and over the semester, we have 2 workshop sessions. During these sessions, students bring in their drafts and critique each other's work. Each session accounts for 5% of the grade. If a student misses a session without an excuse, they forfeit that 5%. An excused absence shifts the weight, making the other workshop session worth 10%. During our first workshop session, there was a student I didn't expect to be absent, but 60 minutes into the class, which lasts 90 minutes, he still hadn't shown up. Normally, I wouldn't allow someone to come in that late, especially to a workshop session. However, he had the best excuse. He handed me a letter from a doctor at the PE department. It turned out he had judo for PE that morning. He had paired up with a more experienced partner who flipped him upside down, and he landed on his head. The note listed his symptoms as temporary memory loss and a possible concussion. The recommendation stated that he should go home. I asked him, "Why didn't you go home?" He replied, "I didn't want to deal with the complications of missing the workshop." My class was on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator and high ceilings, so he had already climbed 4 flights of stairs. I didn't want to waste his effort, so I let him stay. He mentioned that he couldn't remember where he put his pen, which he needed to write comments on his classmates' drafts. I quickly barked at one of his classmates to lend him one. After class, I went to the faculty room and told my colleagues about it. Initially, they all called BS. Then I showed them the note, which completely changed their tune. They started accusing me of creating a pressuring classroom environment, half-jokingly, I think. Story 6. After 9/11s, my small-town high school received bomb threats weekly for 2 months. To make up for lost time, the administration decided to hold classes on a Saturday. Only about 5 other students and I showed up, and every teacher we encountered remarked, "I can't wait to hear the excuses on Monday." Most excuses were typical: family plans, prior commitments, etc. However, one kid was asked to read his dad's note aloud to the class because our first period teacher found it hilarious. In the thickest Southern accent, he read, "My son ain't too smart, but he knows you ain't supposed to be punished for someone else being an idiot. Bought him a 6-pack so he was drunk. Y'all can screw off." I wish we had smartphones back then to record that moment and share it. Story 7. In my senior year of high school, I was often late to class. I struggled with depression and had a 504 plan that allowed me extra time in the hallways to recover from the mental stress of being in class. One day, I was running late when I witnessed a car hit a pedestrian crossing the road, severely injuring him. To make matters worse, the car drove away. My brother, who was in a car behind me, recognized the vehicle as belonging to our neighbor, who was also in first period. I rushed to help the pedestrian, who was a fellow student, using my first aid and lifeguard training. I called an ambulance and waited with the injured student until it arrived. I also called the school to inform them that the student would be going to the hospital. When I finally got to school, my brother and I went to the front office to get a note for tardiness. The admin I had called earlier was waiting for us. He thanked me, gave me a note, and told me to have my teacher call him if there were any questions. My brother mentioned that we knew the driver of the car, and we both headed to our classes. As I entered my first period class late, my teacher didn't want to hear my excuse. I handed her the note and started explaining anyway. The driver of the car was sitting at the back of the classroom, looking terrified. My teacher kept berating me, refusing to believe my story. Halfway through the class, the administrator entered with the school resource officer and informed my teacher that the student needed to come with him for a hit-and-run investigation. He thanked me again for my help and praised me for putting someone else's needs above my own. My teacher's expression shifted from disgust at me to shock and disgust at the driver, finally realizing my story was true. Story 8. Although not a teacher, I was working as a trainer in a call center in South Africa a few years ago. None of my trainees showed up at our 9 a.m. start time. At around 9:15, one of the guys in the group called to inform me that their train had been hijacked. Literally, armed men had boarded the train, taken control, and were robbing everyone. The trainee was very apologetic, assuring me they were on their way as soon as they could. Despite the ordeal, they were only 15 minutes late. That incident was the most South African thing I had ever seen during my time there. Story 9. In my auto class, my teacher let me practice removing and adding the tires on his vehicle. The next morning, about 20 minutes into the first period, there was no sign of him. Suddenly, he burst into the classroom, out of breath and with his hair all messed up. Pointing at me, he demanded, "You, what is the torque wrench used for?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I know you don't know," he replied, exasperated. It turned out one of his tires had come off while he was driving down the highway. He should have checked them after having a student work on his car, so it was partly his fault. Nonetheless, I definitely learned the importance of properly using a torque wrench after that incident. Story 10. I had a college algebra teacher who consistently showed up late or sometimes not at all. The other students found it hilarious because if there was no teacher for 15 minutes, we could leave, resulting in many missed classes throughout the semester. This situation really aggravated me. Pre-YouTube, I struggled to understand the math, and the girl trying to tutor me didn't speak English well. My grade, for the first time ever, was suffering, and I was paying for the class. One day, the teacher arrived about 20 minutes late. I stayed, one of the few who didn't leave early. He walked in, angrily slammed his briefcase on the desk and said, "I apologize for this semester. I have cancer. I'm dying." Then he left. I don't know what happened to him after that. Story 11. In high school, one student once asked our history teacher about the most memorable excuse for being late. The teacher recounted an incident where a student ran in 20 minutes late, turned on the classroom TV, and started flipping through the channels without saying a word. When the teacher asked what he was doing, the student replied that his country was under attack. Confused, the teacher pressed for more information. The student explained that he had heard his dad yelling for him to come back home when he was just down the block. He returned home, where his dad hugged him and showed him the news about the attack before driving him to school late. Our teacher concluded by saying that the only acceptable reasons he ever allowed for lateness were 9/11s or a personal tragedy. Story 12. As a kindergarten teacher, I had one student who was an exceptionally heavy sleeper. This child often arrived late and frequently missed our first class after nap time. No matter what we did, playing music, tilting the bed slightly, asking questions, even gently standing them up, nothing worked. Most kids might give a cheeky grin or some reaction when they don't want to wake up, but not this one. Until they naturally woke up, there was no response. There was nothing medical going on. They just slept like a rock. Story 13. In my senior year of high school, the building was under construction and part of it was completely closed off. To make up for the lack of space, we used extra rooms at a nearby vocational school. If your last class of the day was at the vocational school, you could either take a bus or drive there. I was driving myself and a friend to the same English class when traffic got pretty stop and go. During one of the stop moments, the kid behind me wasn't paying attention and rear-ended me. It was slow-moving traffic, so it was more of a bump. We got out to check for damages and make sure everyone was fine. Our cars were old and beat up, so we decided there was no significant damage and got back in line to head to class. The kid who hit me was also in the same English class. When my friend and I walked in late, our teacher, known for being a stickler, snidely said, "You two better have a good reason for being tardy." My friend laughed and I responded, "Yeah, our classmate just rear-ended us on the way here. You can confirm it with him when he gets here." A minute later, he rushed in saying, "Sorry, I'm tardy. I hit them." The rest of the class laughed, and the stern teacher told us all to get down to business. Story 14. As an English professor, I once had a pretty good student who failed to turn in one of his 2 major term papers. He explained that a contractor working on their house had stolen their safe, and his laptop, which had the paper, was inside it. I believed him because he had always been a diligent student. Over the next few weeks, he started showing up to class looking very tired. He told me he was on a hunt for the person who stole the safe, spending late nights driving around with his cousin. Both of them had recently returned from tours in Iraq and had combat experience. They were determined to find the thief, not just for the laptop, but also because his wife's wedding ring and a lot of cash were in the safe. He rewrote the paper and turned it in, but it wasn't up to his usual standards. He continued attending class, looking more exhausted each time. Eventually, he came to my office hours, looking very pleased. He told me they had found the thief after a long search that involved breaking into a drug den, shaking people down with baseball bats, and even bribing escorts. They had tracked the guy's van to a Taco Bell after getting a tip from an escort. They cornered him and waited for the police. I later read in the news that he had performed a citizen's arrest at the Taco Bell. The police had called in the Secret Service because the thief had used the stolen cash to buy counterfeiting equipment. The student had recovered his wife's wedding ring, the cash, and his laptop. I gladly accepted his original paper and gave it a much higher grade than the rewrite. Talk about stealing from the wrong people. 99% of the population would have just accepted the loss, but not these guys. The thief had messed with the wrong house. Story 15. This isn't a teacher story, but a personal experience that sounds unbelievable. One windy day, I was walking to university after parking my car about a kilometer away from campus. As I crossed an overpass, one of my headphone earbuds fell out. Reaching up to grab it and put it back in, a heavy gust of wind caused me to essentially slap myself, knocking my glasses off and over the barrier onto the road. I stood there stunned, watching my glasses land on the road, just before a semi-truck ran over them with several wheels. I pondered my next move for too long, considering whether to attend class blind, walk back to my apartment 4 kilometers away, or drive home blind. Remembering that attendance was mandatory for marks, I decided to attend class. I walked in 10 minutes late, didn't unpack anything, and just sat there. This led to a discussion with my professor after class, which went splendidly. In hindsight, having mandatory attendance for university classes to earn marks seemed odd to me. None of my other academic classes had that requirement. Story 16. When I was 22, I was attending college night classes after working my day job. The time between getting off work and the start of my first class was tight, but my teacher was laid back and rarely started on time, which worked in my favor. One evening, on my way to class, I was driving on the interstate when a sports car blew past me like I was standing still. Not a minute later, I saw a cloud of smoke and vehicles sliding all over the interstate. The sports car had tangled up with two tractor trailers, and its small frame was crushed under one of them, the roof completely gone. The driver's head was hanging out from the car, and his scalp had been mostly torn off his skull. I grabbed some gloves and a towel from my car and ran to help. I used the towel to hold his scalp in place until the paramedics arrived, while he sat there screaming. When I finally got to class, I walked in holding my books in front of me. The teacher asked what took me so long since I was about half an hour later than usual. I told him that traffic was bad, and he made a joke about how traffic was hellish that night. As I took my seat and put my books down, the room fell silent. Unbeknownst to me, my shirt was covered in blood. Needless to say, I was excused to go clean up and change. How did I not notice my shirt covered in blood? In the moment, with adrenaline pumping, there's a lot going on. I was focused on helping the injured driver and getting to class. It wasn't until I was in the classroom that I realized the extent of the mess on my clothes. Story 17. During my college years, I had a psychology professor who was very strict about punctuality. She told us that the only excuse for being late was a funeral procession, any other reason, and we wouldn't be allowed in. A few weeks into the semester, I was on my way to class, crossing the main road between buildings, when I encountered a long funeral procession. I took a short video as proof and waited on the sidewalk for it to pass. Unfortunately, this made me late to class. When I knocked on the door, the professor approached, ready to reprimand me. I showed her the video of the procession. She looked at it, then said, "Well, I'll be damned. Come on in." Story 18. I remember this vividly from my school days. We had this very quiet, unassuming kid in our class named Brennan. One day, he walked into our German class with about 5 minutes left. We attended a strict Catholic school where teachers were quite intimidating and classrooms were usually silent, especially in junior school. That day, the door flew inwards with such force that our teacher gasped audibly. It had been raining heavily outside. Brennan's hair was plastered to his forehead, his blazer was soaked and dripping, and mud caked his trousers up to his knees. He was breathing heavily. The teacher, clearly shocked, exclaimed, "Brennan, what happened?" We all stared at him in stunned silence. Brennan let out a big sigh and simply said, "I took a shortcut," before heading straight to his seat. That line became iconic in our school for years after.